In this video, we'll take a look at the recently released Neptunia game, Neptunia Sisters vs. Sisters, which is for the PS4, PS5, and PC. There's a lot to talk about, and I think it's a very interesting game. It's a spin-off featuring Nepgear, even though it is part of the main series storyline. The story manages to finally capture some of that magic that made the storyline of the first PS3 game so good. It references and comments on some recent events and happenings with video games and the world that previous games in the series weren't able to do. So I'd say that satire levels are kind of back up to the levels that they used to be back in the beginning. The graphics look pretty good, with all new dungeons, and there's also a new type of battle system, among other things. At this point, I should say thank you to Idea Factory for providing me with the PS5 limited edition. We'll take a look at the limited edition in another video, and that should be out soon, so watch out for that. But for now, we'll focus on the game. And like I said, this is the PS5 version, so watch in 4K if you are watching on an appropriate display. The game takes place within the same dimension as the main storyline. Sometimes Neptunia spin-offs are in their own little universe or dimension, but that's not the case here. While the game will explain the basics of the world to the player, Sisters vs. Sisters is best enjoyed if you've already played at least a previous game or watched the anime. I'm gonna assume that most of you know at least the basics of the series, but if not, the quick crash course is that 4 goddesses represent 4 brands of consoles. Neptune is Sega, Noir is Sony, Blonde is Nintendo, and Vert is Microsoft. So they're personifications of the brands, though it used to be that they represented specific consoles, specifically the Sega Neptune, PlayStation 3, Wii, and then the Xbox 360. But over time, it made more sense to make them represent the brands themselves. So that's kind of what you have now. And then the goddesses' little sisters represent handheld consoles of their respective brands. Each goddess rules over their own land, and they have people that worship them. The game takes place after Neptunia V2, and this time round the theme is handheld consoles versus smartphones. Though I think a better way to describe it is actually that this game parodies and comments on the rise of mobile gaming and how it affected traditional console gaming without, necessarily just branding one side as good and the other as bad. I think it's very well done. The story has a tone that's similar to the first Neptunia PS3 game. It's quite self-aware without randomly breaking the fourth wall for no reason like some of the later games did. The story in Sisters vs. Sisters focuses on Nepgear and the other CPU candidates, Uni, ROM, and RAM, even though the regular goddesses aren't by any means in the background. The plot goes kinda like this. Neptune, Noir, Vert, and Blonde go to the PC continent in order to investigate an SOS signal. While they are gone, Nepgear and co. investigate a horde of monsters that just suddenly appeared outside of Planetoon. After entering a cave, they find a research facility they weren't aware of. Inside, they find a capsule with a girl sleeping in it, and she looks very much like a goddess herself. After she awakens, she seems to recognize Nepgear, but she still ends up trapping the CPU candidates in the capsule, which causes them to fall into a slumber. After the screen fades to black, we hear voices and the CPU candidates are woken up. It turns out they were in there for 2 years and a lot has changed in their absence. Game industry is in turmoil as monster outbreaks called trendy outbreaks have been ravaging the nations. Planetoon was especially affected because not only did they not have their goddess candidate for 2 years, but Neptune also went missing on her trip to the PC continent, which experienced a great calamity, leaving them without a goddess for that entire time. On top of that, the nations find themselves with low amounts of shares, which has been taken away by a new device called the R-Phone. Though, interestingly enough, I think it's, in Japanese they call it the Magiphone, not the R-Phone, but anyways. And now many people spend tons of time on those devices, becoming addicted to social media and gacha games. I think the story is quite well done. It manages to touch on a lot of current events, and thankfully it doesn't go down the consoles good, smartphones bad sort of route. In fact, Nepgear and co. being out of touch with the newest tech and related social trends is often brought up. And then there's also Neptune's disappearance, which actually puts a more serious tone on everything. Though it still has there's a lighthearted atmosphere still to many of the conversations. That's not gone. Another thing I was worried about was how close the plot sounded to Mark II and Rebirth 2 when the game was first announced. But to be perfectly honest, the game's stories don't really feel similar at all. In Mark II and Rebirth 2, Nepgear struggled quite a bit in order to become more confident. And in Sisters vs. Sisters, she spends a day cooped up in her room after finding out her sister's missing. But then she promptly gets going again and travels to the other nations to convince the other goddesses to assist her and the nation of Planetoon. So thankfully, that bit of character development just didn't go, missing. She's a more mature person in this game than she was in the beginning of Mark II and Rebirth 2. In addition, there's some new characters in the mix, like Maho and Anri. Maho is a hyperactive girl who loves smartphones and new tech. Often she's the one joking how the goddess candidates are out of touch with, not knowing about social media things and how to use smartphones and stuff like that. It wouldn't be a NEP game if someone didn't have amnesia, and this time round, Maho is the one who doesn't have any memories. She, along with Anri, a quiet software engineer, are refugees from the PC continent. Anri, by the way, has a very stealthy fanservice outfit. You basically never see it in the game because, just with how much of the sprite you see in the game. But it's very noticeable in the official art when you see the full sprite. In terms of official maker characters, there's two, Higurashi and Shanghai Alice. Higurashi is named after the horror franchise of the same name and shares her appearance, weapon, and basic personality with Rena. Shanghai Alice is the character representing the ever-popular Touhou series. Now, I don't know anything about that series, so obviously the references have just been, they've been going over my head the entire time. So yeah, sorry I can't, comment more on that. Gameplay-wise, it's both a bit familiar and a bit new. Let's take a look at how NEP games usually work. You run around a dungeon and come into contact with enemies to initiate a fight. Once you're fighting, you're in a circle, which is the battlefield, and the fighting is done in a turn-based fashion with regular and special attacks. And you can use items, normal JRPG stuff. In Sisters vs. Sisters, a lot of this still rings true, but the actual fighting has been adapted into a real-time format. It's AP-based, but there's still like these combo paths that you had previously, where you can have like various powerful, fast, and armor break attacks. And you can also jump between the different paths of combos there. One big difference, though, is that now you can run around the entire, battlefield, you call it. So it's not just a small radius that each character can move around in. You also assign special attacks to triangle, and then triangle up and triangle down. Obviously, that's done so you don't have to go into a menu to do special attacks. That being said, you still need to go into the menu to use items, for example. So yeah, there's times where that's unavoidable. Though it is worth mentioning that sometimes, when you're in battle, the characters that you don't control will ask you if it's okay to use items, for example, in order to heal. And if you confirm, then they use the item, as you may imagine. You can also block attacks, which is really something I should learn doing. Throughout this video, you'll see me get hit all the time by the enemy when I should really be blocking. I guess I'm just not used to block attacks in Neptunia games, but anyways. You can switch between 3 characters. I always think that's an awkward number for this series since there's 4 goddesses and 4 CPU candidates. So I think it really should be 4, but that's how it is. In battle, you want to switch characters whenever you can because chaining attacks makes your damage multiplier go up. You can see how it goes from 1 to, times 1.1, 1.2, and so on. A symbol will come up on the screen to indicate that you can actually chain attacks. Every party member gains experience from fights, even when for story reasons they temporarily leave or become unavailable. You'll see them periodically level up even if they aren't present. I like that because it makes character leveling simple, and it's also easy to swap characters back and forth without having to get a lower level character up to speed. Though, if you haven't used them in a while, you probably have to buy them some new weapons. As with other NEP games, you navigate dungeons in a similar way as you do before, though we see some interesting enhancements, changes, and additions. What's the same is the general game flow. Dungeons have multiple floors with enemies running about, and items/treasures laying around which you can collect. In order to advance in the story, you usually have to go to a particular event spot in the dungeon for the story to continue. One thing you'll notice is how all the dungeons are all new. Some look quite good, others are maybe a little bit bland, like the underground ones, but overall it's surprisingly good. While not new to the series, save points are strewn throughout the dungeons, but now there's a noticeable amount more of them and they allow you to do a few things like fast travel between spots in the dungeon or go back to the world map. A convenient change. The mechanics of initiating a fight are noticeably simplified. While hitting enemies from behind still gives you an advantage, there now never is a point where the enemies get an advantage. In the past, you'd be extra vulnerable while trying to hit them, or if your back was turned to them and they get to you first. But that doesn't matter in Sisters vs. Sisters. If that ends up happening, the fight just starts in a normal, neutral way. Also new are some puzzle elements. I was slightly surprised actually. At first I thought it was just some doors you have to, that you have to open by finding their switches that are hidden in other rooms or whatever. But after several hours of playing in dungeons that looked either wooded or, or looked like a cave or a cave with a slightly different color, there was one sci-fi looking dungeon that suddenly had blocks that you had to move to a certain spot in order to, open a path up. Now, I don't mind that, but these so-called puzzles are pretty simple. If you've ever played a Zelda game, this will be a bit too easy to say the least. I mean, you wouldn't even put this in a tutorial, to be honest. But hey, it's a bit different to what we see normally in an EP game, so maybe they can work on that in the future. Something with these new dungeons is that they can be a bit repetitive. I'm pretty sure the dungeons were made from, like, modules. And it does trick you into thinking you're walking in circles sometimes. But then I realized, oh wait, that's just another bit of the dungeon that just happens to look the same. On the other hand, there's places like Planetoon that have a sci-fi urban appearance that look really quite nice. Sure, there's no cars and, not that many people, but there's actually a lot of the city you can run around in, with different districts being available to explore. I think that does a lot for world building, something a lot of the past Neptunia games didn't do that good of a job of. Sometimes we only had background illustrations in cutscenes to go by when it comes to, trying to see what the areas looked like. V2 and V2R had some dungeons that sort of had this urban look to them, but now there's so many more areas that you can go to. And each district has its own visual identity, which I think is really good. There's even buildings with several floors, and Planet Tower has a great view with several buildings being recognizable from high up. Overall, it does a lot to make the world feel more real. Planetoon serves as a home base where you can heal up without using items, and you can buy items, weapons, and accessories. Several chapters into the game, you'll also get access to the arena, which is a way to get items and also level up. There's also a training mode that allows you to fight already fought opponents if you want to get more familiar with how they fight. There's also Neptunia Tower, where you can try and reach the 100th floor, with each 10 floors having a boss. Side quests still exist in Sisters with the Sisters, except that instead of going to the guild, you have to go to Chirper. We've seen Chirper in many Neptunia games, but I think this is the best iteration yet. You get to see what people post in an app rather than just, speech bubbles spread around the map. So that's a way more realistic way of showing that. And there's also tabs, or rather there is a tab showing side quests that you can do. And there's another tab that shows you active and also completed tasks, or quests rather. You've got the usual quests that where they ask you to defeat certain monsters and gather specific items, but you can also find missing people. Not really any different than just going to an event spot, but, it is technically different. A really nice addition to the game is that there are now little quest icons on the dungeons showing you where to go in order to complete your quests. So you don't have to be like, oh, which monsters and which quests or whatever. If there's a little logo there, you can hover over it and it even shows you which monsters you're trying to hunt down. I want to talk about graphics and performance now, and I do think that the game actually looks pretty good. But before we get to that, I want to talk about today's sponsor, NordVPN. Thankfully, there are companies like NordVPN that support the channel and allow me to keep creating the videos I want to make and you guys want to see, which, as you know, is sometimes a troublesome endeavor on YouTube. NordVPN is a fast and secure VPN with more than 5,300 servers in 59 countries. Right now, you can get a deal on a subscription, which you can check out at nordvpn.com/ysn. Link is in the description. Now, this isn't a problem with NEP games like this, but if you play other Japanese niche games, you'll have noticed that you can't get certain games in certain regions. If that affects you, NordVPN can make getting those games easier just by changing your virtual location to something else. So that way, games like Galgun or Valkyrie Drive are suddenly available to you, just like they should have been in the first place. Other geo-restricted content can be accessed like this too, of course. I mentioned this before, but I like watching UK and German TV, and that's how I watch those. I mean, can you believe that Canadians still can't watch the second part of Season 12 of Taskmaster on YouTube? That's a very specific problem, but not a problem for me now. And I can use NordVPN on all my devices. NordVPN is fast and low latency, so it's great for gaming, and it's secure because of AES 256 encryption, meaning you don't have to worry about people snooping on your internet activity even if you're using public Wi-Fi. Additionally, there's also NordVPN's threat protection feature. Threat protection guards you against web trackers, harmful websites, infected files, and intrusive and malicious ads. On the NordVPN Windows or Mac OS desktop app, you can toggle on or off the level of protection, and if you're using Android or iOS, there is Threat Protection Lite, which protects you from ads, unsafe connections, and malicious sites. Right now, you can get NordVPN by going to nordvpn.com/ysn to get a subscription, and it's risk-free thanks to Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Go there to check out the deal, and you can also find the link in the description too. And now let's continue on with the video. Alright, now on to graphics and performance. At this point of the video, you should have seen quite extensively how the game runs and looks on the PS5, which is indeed what this footage shows. 60 frames per second aren't really a thing in this game, at least not on the PS5. I don't think it hinders gameplay, since the game doesn't rely on quick response or anything, but still, like always, 60 FPS would be nice, especially on a PS5, and a PS5 really isn't lacking in power, given how good other games look and run. I'm gonna blame this on optimization. One thing that kind of bothers me when initiating fights and when they end is how the game just suddenly stops and then continues. It's like a long stutter. Kinda brings you out of the flow. I already touched on how the dungeons look during the gameplay section because it made naturally sense to talk about it at that time. I don't really have much to add except I'm just happy to see new dungeons that we haven't seen before. And I really like being able to run around Planetoon. Something I've been wanting to see for a while now is live 2D improvements. And finally, I can say that there actually are improvements. Now, I'm not sure if this is 100% correct, but the first game to my knowledge to use live 2D in cutscenes in a video game is Trinity Universe, which came out in 2009 in Japan and 2010 everywhere else, basically. The first Neptunia game, which came out shortly afterwards, was Trinity Universe, but reskinned and, of course, with its own story and characters. And therefore, it also used live 2D. At that time, it was really innovative to see 2D sprites move, breathe, and just be animated like that. But for years, it's kind of stayed like that. And since the VTuber boom that started at the end of 2019 and, really took off in the summer of 2020, we've seen that technology being pushed much farther since then. In other words, Neptunia looked a little bit old. Plus, there were some spin-offs where they didn't use live 2D at all and just had sprites. So it's been kind of like an animation roller coaster. Thankfully, we are at a high point at the moment. Lip syncing is much better. Characters move a little bit more, like their heads will go side to side, which is not something we've really seen before. And there's also a greater range of expressions. And they can move their arms about, which makes conversations much more appealing to look at. And even the subtle little movements that, weren't there before are noticeable and make the experience better. The menus look quite good. They look new yet familiar. Everything is easy to navigate and fluid to go through. So yeah, I've got no complaints there really. Another visual upgrade is that the battle effects are better. They look nicer than before, and that's very noticeable, especially during fire attacks. Something that this game doesn't have that previous games have are fancy transformations. They're much more shortened now. I always thought that the transformations were fun, so it's a shame that they were gone or that they're shortened now. Especially now, when we've just got an improvement in graphics. Also gone are the level up screens and poses. I personally thought those were fun too because they were different depending on how much health each character had. It's just small things, but hey, I like them, so I wanted to mention their absence. And for no reason at all, I just want to point out that Ram has a cool idle animation. At first I thought it was unique, but it turns out there's a couple of humanoid enemies that actually spin their weapons like that too. When it comes to audio, it's basically what you'd expect from an Neptunia game. The music is very familiar, and it's not like other games like Super Neptunia RPG, which had, for example, a real standout score. There's an English and Japanese dub to choose from, like always. Well, I say always. There was the Senran Kagura crossover, which didn't have English dubs, but we know the reason why. We've discussed that before. Neptunia is one of those games where I actually like the English dubs, but as usual, it doesn't seem like they voiced everything. For instance, when you're walking around in a dungeon, characters will often have conversations about what's going on in the story, and those aren't voiced in English. And because of that, I've often missed that there was actually a conversation going on. And the reason for that is because the menus, or like the HUD rather, keeps fading in and out when you're stopping and moving and all that stuff. So it kind of visually blends in with all the activity that happens on the screen. Having the voices in Japanese makes it very clear that there's a conversation going on because, well, you hear it. There's still a few things about the game I didn't cover or spend too much time with that I want to mention. For example, Lily Rank, a familiar mechanic for any Nep fan. In this game, there doesn't seem to be a way to raise affection between characters. They just serve as support, and as you progress, you'll see there'll be more benefits. I guess it makes sense in a way because it makes things a little bit easier, but I liked it because in the past you'd unlock voice lines and things like that. Also, disc creation is something I never touched throughout the game. I don't think it's necessary, as a little bit of grinding makes you strong enough if you ever find yourself a little bit underpowered. So that's been my experience with Neptunia Sisters vs. Sisters. It recaptures what made a lot of the previous games great, while also adding in some welcome improvements. Remember to stay tuned for the limited edition review video. That should be out in the near future, or perhaps it already is out if you're watching in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.